This is a lecture for my Anatomy and Physiology 2 students. This is a lecture about the immune system. So talking about the immune system is a functional system. So it's not a system like we've learned about before. Since this is a functional system, you'll see it has various components. Components like body responses, cells, molecules, and what they do to complete their goal. Their goal of the immune system is to neutralize or kill pathogens that would otherwise cause death or disease in our body. Now, the immune system can be broken down into first, second, and third line of defense. When we look at defense as a whole for our body, the first and second lines of defense are what we call our natural resistance. So components of our natural resistance are kind of think of them as body responses and molecules in the cells that help us out with fending off these invaders. Now, natural resistance is also called innate because we're basically born with all this ability. So innate immunity or non-specific immune response. So there are a few different names that we attribute to this natural resistance, and this is part one of natural resistance. So when we think about why do we need the immune system, it is to fend off these pathogens. What is a pathogen? A pathogen is an agent capable of producing disease. Many different things can be pathogens. The immune system works to provide us protection against them. For the most part, when we think about pathogens, we think about bacteria and viruses, parasites, maybe some fungi. There are some types of fungi like molds, certain types of mold that can be considered a pathogen. We have environmental pollutants and even toxins that are produced by living organisms. The other pictures on the slide you'll see are various bacteria and viruses. Some of those pictures were taken with a microscope and colored in later on. And for most part, when we go over the natural resistance, even the immune system proper, I will give examples on bacteria and viruses. I usually default to those two. All right, so we're going to talk about the components of natural resistance. And one component is inflammation. So inflammation, what could trigger inflammation are things like abrasions, cuts and scrapes, pathogens, chemical irritations, distortion and disturbance of cells, and even extreme temperatures can cause inflammation in our body. Inflammation has three major functions. So one function is to limit the spread of pathogens. So inflammation can be local or it could be widespread. Inflammation can also be acute and it could be chronic. So when you have an abrasion, I'm going to use this as an example because that's the pictures that I have up on the screen. So when you have an abrasion, a cut or a scrape, and that's going to be local. You're going to have some local inflammation. One of the functions of inflammation is to limit the spread of pathogens. So how does it do that? First of all, you're going to see vasodilation. Vasodilation is when the blood vessels are going to dilate and therefore bring more blood into the region. And what this does, it brings more blood into the region and it also brings certain cells of the immune system into the region. And what happens is you start to see a clot around the abrasion, a clot around the area. What that clot does is it prevents the spread of any, let's say, pathogens like bacteria or viruses that could have gotten through the barrier. Prevents the spread. Something else that it does is it tends to activate the immune system proper. So it's going to activate the specific immune system or the acquired immune system. Another function of the of inflammation is phagocyte mobilization. Now, phagocyte is a cell like a macrophage, and their job is to engulf and destroy dead and broken cells, but also pathogens. So this extra blood being brought into the area because of the inflammation also brings in phagocytes that will engulf and destroy pathogens. A third function of inflammation is that it will set the stage for repair. So typically inflammation is caused by something that has injured the cells for whatever reason. Even pathogens will injure cells. It's going to bring in the molecules, inflammation will bring in the molecules needed to help repair those tissues. Now, inflammation has some cardinal signs. If you've never heard of cardinal signs before, this is kind of what is indicative of this particular concept. So cardinal signs of inflammation would be signs that are attributed to inflammation. There are four. One is calor. Calor means heat. Think of calorie. Calor means heat. So when a tissue is inflamed, it is actually putting off heat. Number two is rubor. Rubor means redness. So what is the degree of redness? And the more vasodilation, the more redness that you're going to see. Tumor means swelling. So what is the degree of swelling? And dolor means pain. So you could have various degrees of pain associated with inflammation. Now, the words that I have at the very bottom of the slide, histamine, bradykinins, prostaglandins, these are words that you're going to hear from me even later on in the semester. These terms, these are molecules in the body that will increase inflammation. So histamine, when it's released, it will increase inflammation. Bradykinins increase inflammation, as do prostaglandins. They're going to increase inflammation. They help to regulate the inflammatory response. Now, whenever you see the suffix itis, itis, that denotes inflammation. So think of gingivitis, arthritis. It's inflammation of the gums or inflammation of the joints. And that inflammation is typically caused from pathogens, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Now, for inflammation, you might be surprised that we're even talking about inflammation because typically we think inflammation, we think bad. But acute or short term or even localized inflammation is good for us when we're talking about natural resistance. So it does play a beneficial role in our natural resistance. However, if inflammation is widespread and it lasts a long time, that can actually work against us. So a little bit of inflammation at the site for a short period of time is actually beneficial to us as far as natural resistance goes. Long-term inflammation, not so good for us. The next component of natural resistance we're going to talk about is fever. Fever has another name called pyrexia. Now, what is fever? Fever is the elevation of body temperature. And fever can be caused by many different things. It can be caused from infections, it can be caused from inflammation, and to a much lesser extent, fever can be caused by certain medications, toxins, poisons, and even cancer. Now, our normal body temperature. Do you know what our normal body temperature is? Our normal body temperature is considered 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 1.0. That is actually an average. And there has been some talk in the scientific community about changing that average. There is some papers done, published by Stanford Medical, and it's looking like their data is showing that our normal should be a little bit cooler than it actually is. We might see, you guys might see that in the future, that number being adjusted. But for right now, our normal is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 1 degree. Now, when thinking of fevers, we have some set numbers. So 104 degrees Fahrenheit is suggested seek medical attention. 106 degrees Fahrenheit for adults, what we tend to see is that it starts to become life-threatening at 106. The reasoning behind that is because proteins start to be denatured inside of our cells. And once our proteins become denatured because of that high heat, then it's not conducive for life. Now, we do make proteins very high rate inside of our cells, but we can't replace them faster than what they're being denatured. 108 is considered fatal. Now, a slightly elevated fever does have some functions as far as natural resistance goes. One function is to mobilize defenses. So it stimulates white blood cell proliferation. That means it's going to make more white blood cells. White blood cells are the cells that help us fight infections. Something else, another function is to kill pathogens. So a fever can actually kill pathogens. Now, pathogens like bacteria and viruses, certain parasites, they all have an optimum temperature. They have evolved to have an overlap of an optimum temperature as far as humans have. Now, if our body can increase our temperature to a point where we exceed the optimum temperature for the pathogen, we can kill that pathogen. So elevated fevers, having elevated temperature or a fever when we're sick can actually help us. Now, of course, if temperature goes out of control and hits 104 or above, we need to bring it down, or we start doing more damage to our own body. But if we have an elevated temperature that doesn't go that high, but also exceeds the optimum temperature for the pathogen, we can kill that pathogen. So a little bit of a fever is actually a good thing, as long as it doesn't get out of control. A third function is that it can increase tissue repair. If you probably learned in chemistry that if you increase the temperature, you increase the amount of chemical reactions. And when you have tissue damage, a fever can help repair those tissues by increasing the chemical reactions. Now, pyrogens. What are pyrogens? Pyrogens are molecules that will increase our temperature. So pyrogens, because of these molecules, think of it as a reaction to pathogens. We can find various pyrogens or these molecules on the surface of pathogens. So that is a clue that our body uses to increase our temperature to fight the pathogen. Another term on the slide is febrile. So febrile means associated with a fever. All right, so just as with inflammation, a little bit of a fever, a little bit of an elevation in our normal body temperature actually works for us when we're talking about natural resistance. It's good for us. But long-term or very high fevers actually work against us. All right, now we're going to talk about molecular defenses as it relates to natural resistance. Molecular defenses means molecules. So we're going to talk about some very specific molecules. The first one is interferon. Interferon is an antiviral enzyme. It is actually a type of cytokine. So if you've never heard of a cytokine before, cytokines are molecules produced and released by an immune cell that is picked up by another type of immune cell. So interferon is a type of communication between two immune cells. That's why I have the two girls talking. So to help you remember that interferon is a type of molecule that's used for communication. Now, interferon is released by infected cells and also lymphocytes. So there's different types of interferon. What interferon does is it induces cells to produce antiviral proteins. Now, whenever I think of interferon, I think of, I kind of dub it the save yourself molecule. So take a look at the bottom picture. And over on the left, on the bottom picture, you have a cell that's been infected with a virus. Now, here's the thing, viruses are not alive. Viruses have to infect a living cell in order to make more of them, more little viruses. So once they infect a living cell, usually that living cell eventually dies, okay? Because it takes over that cell, hijacks that cell, uses that cell's machinery to make more viruses. Now, it does get a little bit more complicated than that, and once you get into microbiology, you'll learn all about it. But infected cells, so let's say this virus infects a cell, and that infected cell is being taken over. It does have the ability, certain cells have the ability to create interferon, and it creates the interferon and secretes it out. That interferon would be taken in by neighboring cells that haven't been affected by the virus yet, that haven't been infected. That interferon could give those uninfected neighboring cells the ability it needs to block the virus from getting in. So that's pretty incredible that a cell that is infected with a virus can immediately send a signal to a neighboring cell in the form of interferon and give it the instructions needed in order to block that virus from getting in. So that's why I call it the save yourself molecule. This cell has already been infected. It's sending a signal in the form of interferon to a neighboring cell. I'm going down. There's nothing else you can do for me, but here's the instructions to save yourself. So these are interferon is an antiviral protein. So it can give an uninfected cell the instructions for blocking the virus, blocking viral infection. It also mobilizes very specific cells of the acquired immune system, kind of mobilizes them, kind of puts them on alert. All right, the next molecule we're going to talk about is complement. Complement with an E. Complement is actually a group of 20 plus plasma proteins that circulate in your blood all the time in their inactive form. And when they are activated, they will help us with our natural resistance. Now, these are a group of 20 plasma proteins, like I said, and they all have certain numbers and maybe some letters associated with them. The image above gives you an indication of the different types of complement. Now, complement, when it's activated, it will form a cascade event. So think of the domino effect. So one type of complement will activate a different type of complement, which will in turn activate a different type of complement, and on down the line, till you get down to the end of the line where you're going to see some action, something occurs as a result of that complement cascade. There are many things can result as a result, no, many things can result because of this complement cascade that help us with our natural resistance. We're just going to talk about a few. For one, it can enhance phagocytosis. We have a term for that, and that's called opsonization. So opsonization means enhancing phagocytosis. A type of cell that undergoes phagocytosis is a macrophage. You're probably most familiar with a macrophage. Macrophage will engulf and destroy dead and broken cells and even pathogens. So let's say it is a pathogen. Let's say it's a bacterial cell, and complement will enhance phagocytosis, kind of like sugar coating it. So yeah, it's going to eat it anyway, but if you put some sugar on it, sugar coat it, it's going to make it much easier to eat. So think of the opsonization as sugar coating a pathogen. It makes it much easier to eat, makes it more efficient, makes the macrophage gobble it up much faster. Okay, something else that is a result of a complement and complement cascade is that it can lyse pathogens directly. Lyse means to break open. Lyse means to slice or to break open. So complement can actually, we can use complement to break apart pathogens, break their cells, break through their cell walls, or other type of molecule. And another function is to intensify inflammation and other immune responses. So when we activate other types of complement cascades, we can increase inflammation or increase other types of immune responses. So that's how these types of molecules play a role in natural resistance. All right, iron binding proteins. Now iron. We all know about iron and why we need iron. Can you think of one reason why our body needs iron? Well, you might think iron and you might think the blood, and that's good thinking because we use iron when we make hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is in our red blood cells. And what do we use hemoglobin for? We use it to bind oxygen. So oxygen binds to the iron in the hemoglobin. Now, we get iron from the things that we eat, and we will recycle iron. We will recycle as much as we can. Now, here's the thing. Free floating iron. Free floating iron in our blood is not a good thing for us. It can be toxic if we have too much free floating iron. So in our body, we have molecules that will bind to iron, and then it's not toxic to us. So think of those molecules, these iron binding molecules, as they rush into the blood and they're holding hands with the iron. And so the iron cannot exert its negative effects on us. If we had too much iron, free floating iron in our blood, yes, it would definitely be toxic to us. So what does this have to do with natural resistance? Well, the thing is, bacteria, for one, which is a pathogen, needs free-floating iron in order to stay alive. So if our body can increase the amount of iron-binding proteins and decrease the amount of free-floating iron, we are sequestering it away from any bacteria that could pose a problem for us. So if we have a bacterial infection that has reached our blood, it's going to try to use all of that free-floating iron. What our body is going to do is increase the amount of iron-binding proteins and bind up that free-floating iron and keep it away from the bacteria. So the good thing about iron-binding proteins is that it binds up iron and keeps it away from the bacteria that happens to need it in order to thrive and grow. The last type of molecule that we're going to talk about that plays a role in molecular defense as part of natural resistance are called defensins. And there's quite a few different types of defensins. As you can see from the picture above me, that each type of defensin will have different functions. One type of defensin is found in the neutrophils, which is a white blood cell. They're cytotoxic granules. Defensins are peptides. They're a type of peptides. And I'm going to use the one that is found in neutrophil. And what they do is they will poke holes in cell membranes. Now, in the cell membranes of, let's say, bacteria and fungi and even some viruses, they will poke holes in their structure. Now, I chose this picture over to the side here because I like that it just gives you the visual. So the defensin is kind of an egg-shaped green color, and when those defensins are released, I said that they're going to poke holes. So that's what they do. They disrupt membranes, and which leads to a hole in the membrane. So if you're poking a hole in the membrane, let's say of a bacterial cell, that's going to cause cytoplasm to spill out, and that's going to cause that cell to die. So poking holes in membranes will cause those cells to die. If it's a virus, it's going to poke a hole in a type of membrane that surrounds this virus and then cause that virus to be not able to infect anymore. So defenses are molecules that help us with that natural defense, with our natural resistance, as far as killing bacteria, fungi, and even some types of viruses. Okay, so I've broken down natural resistance into two parts for our recorded lecture. This is the end of part one. So now I want you to look for part two, and we'll finish up talking about the skin and mucous membranes and the rest of natural resistance for our immune system.